go on to the work of Edward Said, who took Foucault's work basically and linked it to the way that colonialism had constructed other races. So how we understand other races is incredibly relevant to contemporary politics. I'm going to bring it up to date a bit. I've got a really nice piece of film with Edward Said himself explaining his ideas in relation to the politics of the end of the 20th century. So I'm going to go on now to the revision. So just to remind you of what we did last week, this is discourse. I'm going to link the notion of discourse, which is what we were studying last week, specifically to the body, how we understand bodies. When I'm talking about sexuality, of course, I'm talking about the body, but it extends into all of the ways that we both understand, use, and reflect on our bodies in everyday life. You'll see what I mean. So we learnt last week that discourse constructs bodies as objects of knowledge. What this means is, what I was talking about was the way that science, and in particular medical science, produces a body of knowledge that is incredibly powerful. This is what Foucault called discourse. This body of knowledge gives rise to what he called regulated statements. Now, don't run away with the idea that just because scientific knowledge is produced and it becomes the orthodoxy by which we understand everything, that it therefore regulates what you're allowed to say. What he means by regulated statements, not that it prohibits anything. It doesn't stop you saying unicorns exist. If that's what you want to believe, that's entirely up to you. Okay? You don't get punished for that necessarily, other than, okay, I suppose, you could be diagnosed with some sort of delusion. But, you're perfectly free to believe that there is a body in the world that is designated unicorn, and that it has a horn in the middle of its head and is probably covered in sparkles and pink glitter or something, okay? So you're allowed to pretty much believe and say anything that you like, but everything that you say is regulated by the surrounding discourse. So saying that unicorns exist is actually regulated by cultural institutions, the media in this case. I went to buy some foam bath the other day, and all I could find was unicorns. I found it quite peculiar. There is a discourse, a cultural discourse about cute animals, which regulates what you say about unicorns, no matter what you say about unicorns, okay? So, leaving unicorns aside for a moment, there is a cultural discourse that regulates everything that you say about bodies, no matter what that thing is. So there's no big lightning bolt from heaven going to come down and zap you if you tell lies about bodies. You can say lots of unacceptable things, and people are doing it all the time on the internet, okay? Nobody's zapping them. But those statements are regulated by the discourse surrounding things like race, gender, and sexuality. They wouldn't be triggering if they weren't. Nobody would bother to try and shock people if there were no regulated discourses around, and if they weren't highly political, okay? And all those nasty things you see on the internet are all about bodies. They're all about keeping bodies in their place. So, discourse also provides the terms under which we are responsible for something called the self. That is, you're supposed to regulate yourself according to prevailing discourses. And these prevailing discourses are largely about, again, race, gender and sexuality. They're also highly medicalised. And remember, we're talking about Michel Foucault here, and I told you last week he was gay, and he identified himself as needing psychiatric treatment, and he hospitalised himself. He regulated his body according to prevailing discourses about norms of sexuality. And we do it all the time. We may not identify ourselves as deviant and in need of treatment, but we may identify ourselves as having a bad hair day. That's in the same category. It's about bodies, acceptable appearances, and discourses of beauty and ugliness, which are related, of course, to femininity and masculinity, something that we're going to be discussing next week. And also, as you will see during this lecture, to discourses about race. It's also, of course, medicalised discourse. Having a bad hair day is also medicalised because our notions of beauty, our normative notions of beauty, are regulated by the discourse around health and what is thought to look healthy, what is an acceptable body, actually what is an acceptable, if you're a woman, an acceptable reproductive body. Okay? So all these discourse, there's not just one discourse which regulates what it is permissible to say about bodies. There are several discourses which come together, several bodies of knowledge, very powerful bodies of knowledge, which come together to regulate the statements that you can make about bodies at any given time. Are we okay so far? Good. So, yes.
Sorry, how are you using bodies in the way you're talking? Are you using it like literally, or are you using it in a kind of more technical?
I'm using it literally.
Okay.
And it's not just human. I mean, perhaps it's probably better to think of human bodies at the moment. I went to the unicorns because a lot of the bodies that we regulate ourselves against, if you like, that we measure ourselves against, a complete fantasy. There is an ideal body out there for everybody. It's a complete fantasy. It's as much of a fantasy as a unicorn. Okay. So these discourses instruct us. I'm going to keep banging on about gender as well during this lecture because I want to prepare you for next week when I'll be speaking specifically about gender. Discourses instruct us in the maintenance of gendered norms for masculinity and femininity. And whether you like it or not, you may describe yourself as gender fluid. You may have doubts about your gender. The mere fact that you can use terms like that are because your ideas about gender and sexuality are regulated by discourse. So constantly we are measuring ourselves in terms of these gendered norms. And the body in contemporary culture is the place where we demonstrate our cultural capital. This is where we demonstrate our taste, and I'm not going to lecture about this guy at length, but there's a very well-known social scientist from the end of the 20th century, another French person called Pierre Bourdieu, who did a massive study of the relationship between taste and social class in France, admittedly, but you know, if you read his book called Distinction, you will see that it applies very well to British culture, applies as much to contemporary culture, in fact even more so than to the mid-20th century culture he was analysing. And we accrue cultural capital, we demonstrate our taste according to our cultures, the culture to which we believe that we belong. And you can have as much subcultural capital as you can, dominant cultural capital, okay? There are certain, and we all know this, that there are certain ways in which we style our bodies which are deemed to be middle class. There are certain ways that bodies are styled which are deemed to be working class. And what's more, deemed to be correct working class or middle class expressions of femininity or masculinity, age, youth, etc. There's even taste that's associated with certain professions, so that you demonstrate your cultural capital in terms of your ability to perform correctly as part of the profession that you belong to. Okay? So bodies are what we're all obsessed with all the time. And of course, demonstrating your cultural capital means going shopping. So contemporary capitalism absolutely thrives on the perpetuation of these discourses, which affect how we both understand our bodies and how we conform to our idea of cultural capital or not. Even rejecting it is conforming in a way. Even rejecting it is presenting a self to the world which has a message attached to it about taste and distinction. And we still go shopping. So consequently, I've said there in bold, the body becomes a site of political struggle. All bodies are sites of political struggle. I just want to, before I go on to Edward Said, remind you of Foucault's repressive hypothesis. I didn't use this term last week, but it is the term that he uses. Remember, I talked about his chapter in his introduction to the history of sexuality, where he talks about we other Victorians. And the idea that, we assume that sexuality is natural, that it's an instinct, that it's somehow outside of culture, that it is what perhaps perpetuates social structures rather than what such social structures produce. Foucault kind of flips that around. And remember I said that, we always assumed that Victorians were very repressed about sexuality, that they didn't talk about it. And then we had a sexual revolution in the 60s and hey presto, everybody was at it. Well, as I said last week, the truth, that is very, very far from the truth. And the reason for that is connected to our study this week of Orientalism. Because the Victorians were terrified of sexuality because they were terrified of reproduction. And all those scientific studies of sexuality, all that identification of bodies and marking of bodies in terms of their ability to reproduce, hence Victorian notions of feminine beauty, was about race. It was about the reproduction of the colonizer to differentiate us from the colonized. Okay, so sexuality and race, very, very much connected. So bear in mind then that Foucault's argument is that Victorians, and by Victorians I mean, okay, Queen Victoria, she was the queen of this country. Whoever translated Foucault's history of sexuality, presumably, I don't know what it is in French. He called the chapter We Other Victorians, but of course Foucault was French. I'm not sure he even cared about Queen Victoria, maybe he did. But this is a period of history. This is pretty much the 19th century. It's a period of great upheaval, pretty much like the period of upheaval we're going through right here, right now. And it produces a lot of discourse. Massive bodies of knowledge get produced in the 19th century, and a huge amount of them, if you read your Foucault, you'll see how many there are about sexuality and reproduction. So there I've got a list there, which I don't need to read out, that are produced by these discourses. So the discourses produce these subject positions, these categories, into which people can fall at various times in their lives. And Foucault's theory of panopticism is about the surveillance that we subject ourselves and others to constantly to ensure we either are falling into the category we feel comfortable in or to spot others that don't conform to that category. Or we can be anxious about not conforming to a category, but we're at it all the time. And it's very much connected to the way we style our bodies and the way we spend our money. Okay, are we all right with all that? Okay. So, on to Edward Said. He was based in America, but he grew up in Palestine and Egypt. And he first published Orientalism in 1978. It's an incredibly famous book. It gets republished. It's been published in editions all over the world. This is why Foucault's so important. Edward Said makes use of Foucault's notion of discourse in his arguments in Orientalism. And as you'll see next week, a lot of the feminists of the same period, the late 60s and 1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s, also make use of Foucault's ideas, because the notion of discourse is so useful for understanding the circulation of power, not only in social context, but in cultural context. It helps us to understand how cultures perpetuate discourse and how, therefore, knowledge is dispersed throughout any given culture. There's nobody up there at the top of whatever, telling you to survey yourself, to make sure that you look okay, to buy the right things to conform to your notion of taste or your group's notion of taste. It's insidious, it's in conversation, it's on TV. Media is hugely important. So it's through the media, through conversations with other people, and what you read. So it's on the internet, which is also the media, of course. So discourse is pervasive and it's dispersed. Nobody is pointing lightning bolts at you for saying the wrong thing. You do it to yourself. Okay? So, Edward Said unfortunately died in 2003. But prior to that, he had a massive impact on understandings of race and conflict. So what Orientalism then is his big idea. And it is the name of a discourse that is produced mainly by the British and French empires around the end of the 18th century and throughout the 19th century. And it continues to this day. It just goes through changes. It adapts to different cultural conditions. Now, at the time of the 18th century, this is knowledge produced in travel writing, for instance. There's a lot of travel writing about. Of course, the middle classes and the aristocracy did a lot of travelling, and they wrote about their travels. They were kind of bloggers before the internet. And it was very popular travel writing. And it was really, gee whiz, look at these foreigners. That was kind of what it was about. It's like we went and looked at the animals in the zoo. Okay, so I have to say that there's I can't stand the art critic of The Guardian. I hope he's not watching.
He is.
Yeah, he's there. Oh my God. Hi, Jonathan. But, I found an article once where he was absolutely insisting that all this travel writing was actually a very nuanced and appreciative understanding of Oriental cultures. I beg to differ, and I don't think he read his Said properly. It wasn't. It was whenever it appeared to be nuanced and appreciative, actually it was a bit like saying, isn't that animal cute? Okay. I'm looking in a cage and saying, isn't that animal cute? It was not an understanding of these cultures in all their complexity. And it was pretty much Oriental cultures, the far and Middle East. I have to say, Orientalism, you can apply the idea, the theory, to Africa as well. In fact, to anywhere in the world colonised by the Europeans. But Said, of course, was specifically interested in what he called the Orient. So you've got travel writing, you've also got colonial bureaucracy. Of course, this produces a huge amount of discourse because in order to administer an empire, you've got these massive institutions. British Council is one that is still surviving. What else is there? I can't remember anything with British in the title, actually. They are the sort of surviving institutions of the colonial period when you had to have a huge administrative architecture to keep the empire under control. And keeping the empire under control required a huge amount of production of reports, rules and regulations, which were informed by ideas about what you were keeping under control. So to go back to the animals under the zoo, they have feeding regimes and they have particular, they have vets that come along and say, well, you can't feed that animal that sort of foods, and you've got to keep it away from, heat, etc. Yeah, pretty much the same thing. This is what, the colonial bureaucracy was designed to basically keep the natives under control. And there was, I read a document, it might have been Inside actually, where there was a lot of young men that were going to places like India, was mentioned specifically, that they were going out to India to administer, to be colonial administrators. And of course, and they found this really wonderful, amazing culture. And that's where the phrase going native comes from, because they just decided they wanted to stay and sod coming back and marrying a good British woman and reproducing good British kids. And there was a bit of panic about this, a bit of moral panic about this. And this is when English literature gets invented. English literature at this point is a kind of hobby. It's not really an academic discipline. Somewhere towards the end of the 18th, sometime in the 19th century, I can't remember exactly when, it becomes an actual academic discipline, because it was realised that religion wasn't going to do the job. You couldn't tell these young men, you're offending against the tenets of the Bible, but you could give them morally uplifting novels to read in the hope that they would come home and behave themselves. And so this is kind of the origins of English literature as an academic discipline. So that's all connected then to the colonial bureaucracy. The civil service, I have to say in particular, is about, the word civil is also the root of civilization. It's about keeping civil institutions in place and therefore keeping people in their place. You've also got the academic sciences, and this is what Foucault is particularly interested in. So sciences like biology, so the internal structure of the body, anthropology, the structure of societies other than European or American, ethnology, the study of people. All these sciences try to describe to ourselves who we are by describing to us what other people are. They're fairly new sciences. I mean, in Foucault's work, I think you see them emerging in the late 18th century. It's when, science really only kicks off in the 17th century as a serious pursuit. As something understood as a way to produce truth. And then you get gradually the idea that, well, okay, if we are finding out the truth about life, the universe and everything, maybe we should be trying to find out the truth about us. So the human sciences like biology, anthropology and the social sciences get going. They're fairly recent sciences. It was not thought before then that we could actually turn our attention to studying who we are and how we function socially. Biology is a little bit older because we had medicine before that. But so these are kind of, gee whiz sciences. Wow, now we can know ourselves. We can know ourselves in very intimate ways, and we can know ourselves as distinct from others. And this is what the sciences were really engaged in doing. Now, I inherited this document from, well, actually this is a document that basically got passed around in academia some years ago. I can't trace the origin. I don't think anybody else has been able to find the original. It's actually a bit of a page from the Harmsworth Encyclopedia, from sometime in the mid-19th century, we think, but we're not absolutely certain, okay? But it's really illustrative of the way that these powerful knowledges are produced and their effect on racial categories. I'm sorry if you can't see it very well, but it's kind of old, and I scanned it from one of those overhead projection things that was all covered in marmalade or something. So I cleaned it up as best I can. I'll read it to you, okay? So if I point, I shall have to leave the mic. So you're going to have to try and see for yourself. You've got a column there on the left, and the column on the extreme left gives physical characteristics of bodies. So you've got, I've had to take my glasses off to see my computer. You've got things like skin and hair and nose and cheekbones and that sort of thing. And then across the top, you've got different racial types. So the one on the left, even though you can't read it, actually says Negro. You've got Mongoloid, Mongolio, I think it says, rather than Mongoloid. Then you've got American, which is presumably Native American. And then you've got Caucasian. And what you see is that you've got certain physical features. So physical features are listed to begin with, but then you come down to temperament, as if it's all equivalent. So you've got all these physical features. So if you look a particular way, and unfortunately I can't see it well enough to read it, unless I leave the mic and shout. Hang on. So I'm going to leave the mic and shout. This is the so-called Negro column. And you've got something like skin, very dark brown or blackish, okay? And you've got skull, long, index 72, whatever the hell that means. And then you come down to temperament. And temperament down here says sensuous, indolent, improvident, fitful, passing easily from comedy to tragedy, little sense of dignity, surprise, surprise. Hence, easily enslaved. Oh, all right, that just justifies everything. Slight mental development after puberty. Okay. When you come here to the Caucasian side, you've got the other typical sort of description. Yeah, there's nothing very interesting there. But look, if you come down to the temperament, serious, steadfast, solid and stolid in the north, fiery, impulsive, fickle in the south, active, enterprising, imaginative everywhere, science, art and letters highly developed. Okay, so this is knowledge. This is an encyclopedia. This is the sort of thing people had in their homes. And it was an authority. It was an authority that you kept in your home, and it was something that you could keep, that had scientific knowledge right there for you, and it was accepted as the truth. So this is what perpetuates discourse. Having these ideas within a medium that purports to be truth. Can you see where I'm going with this? The internet is, so Wikipedia is so often wrong. I hope you know that. I mean, it's a brilliant resource. I mean, I actually, I admire Jimmy Wales. I can give them money. I mean, I've been too lazy to write anything for them, so I really shouldn't be complaining. But for every article where you think, oh yeah, that's really good, there's another one that's complete bollocks. So even Wikipedia, you can't really trust. But how the hell do you know unless it's a subject you know something about? I mean, I might have gone around repeating rubbish about, I don't know, cookery, which is something I know nothing about, because I read it in Wikipedia. So same thing, okay. But these encyclopedias, these heavy tomes, these carefully bound books that people paid an awful lot of money for, they believed they were paying for truth. So this is how this sort of discourse of race is perpetuated. I've got another slide here. Anthropometrics. This was massive in the 19th century, particularly after the invention of photography. photography wasn't an art until late in the 20th century. In the 19th century, it was a the camera was a scientific instrument. And again, it was believed that, like the microscope, it could reveal truth. All it revealed was, in this case, bodies. The truth is constructed through discourse. And there are several discourses at work here. Now, this particular anthropometrical images are from our Australian Aboriginal peoples. But anthropometrics were used all over the world to show the truth of that Harmsworth Encyclopedia entry. And the truth was shown through measurement. We measure everything. I was going on about Fitbits last week. We are a fanatically measuring culture, and always have been a frantically measuring culture. And measuring heads, bodies, and finding a typical ratio was what anthropometrics were all about. Now, this was not only dangerous for people of other races, there were people of the white race who got very panicky about anthropometrics. As I'll show you next week, it extended off, obviously, in the end, obviously, to white women. So that if anthropometrics could be shown to indicate that certain facial features and bodily features and also measurements of faces and bodies were indicative of belonging to a specific race, then hey, they could be indicative of all sorts of things, like being a natural prostitute. And I'll show you next week or the week after, depending on, I haven't worked out those 2 lectures yet, but there was a thing called Darwin's ear, which was basically the shape of an earlobe that was thought to belong only to prostitutes. So it was really easy for blokes to get rid of their wives. So they just sort of went, look, you've got a Darwin's ear, you're a prostitute, I divorce you, kind of thing. So anthropometrics, photography in itself, became almost an instrument of torture. So you've got the Harmsworth Encyclopedia saying, if you find a head measurement like this, along with dark skin, this person is easily enslaved and is never going to mature. So you might as well enslave them. And hey, maybe they don't have dark skin. Maybe their skin's a little bit dusky. But if you find that head measurement, well, yeah, they've probably got enough black person in them to be a slave. See where I'm going with this? You could actually apply it to almost anybody. And of course, that's what we still do. We no longer have anthropometrics. We're a bit more sophisticated about it. Nevertheless, we're making the same judgments and using the same discourse to identify people of other races. So, this is from Said, or rather this is me kind of really praising Said. He says that this is what happens is that the Orient is produced out of an understanding of the white European being the self and the Oriental being the other. And the other has certain characteristics that are found, as he says, across the Orient. That there is a kind of myth of Orientalism, and this myth includes these characteristics, which you can then measure yourself against. It allows white European, particularly white European males, to feel very comfortable in their selfness, in their subject position, because they have these people that they keep quite close to them, which they measure themselves against constantly. They don't want to get rid of the Orientals. They don't want Oriental people to disappear. They want them as close as possible, because they offer a constant comparison. So, the comparison is the white European and the Oriental. The white European is quintessentially masculine. Oriental, says Zaid, are understood as somehow feminine. as not quite having achieved full masculinity. The white European is associated with the mind and the Oriental with the body, which is, of course, as you'll see next week, tends to also hold true for the gender distinction. This is because white Europeans, this is where the Enlightenment happens. So the Enlightenment pretty much happens in Europe. We have an Enlightenment. I have to say, other continents, other cultures have had their own enlightenments way before we did, but we ignored them and gloried in our own, in which it really starts with and I'm sure you've heard about this, a philosopher, another French guy called René Descartes, who at some point, and I say at some point, he said, as you know, this cogito ergo sum, I think, hence I am. Okay, now he could have said that 10 years earlier and people would have locked him up or something. But he said it at a time when people were becoming very uncertain that God was hanging around in heaven guaranteeing the state of the world, guaranteeing the way that the world was. People were beginning to look outside of themselves and outside of religion. So you get things like, the development of the telescope, the ability to see further, the ability to look at other planets. And so when Descartes comes along and says cogito ergo sum, he's actually saying, well, what we are is mind. This is the human potential is to think. Humans are about thinking. That's all they are. There's a chapter in his book, Meditations, where he says of God that he exists, because of course he's panicking, because this is the time when if you said that God didn't exist, that you could be locked up or tortured or something. So he kind of says it is God's plan for people. Of course he said man, let's say people. God's plan for people is that we should think, and hey, this is our job in the world. We should not only think, we should find out everything we can about the world through our rational faculty. Okay? So the mere fact that we think means that we should be looking at the world, understanding it, and making knowledge about it. And so it became kind of okay to proceed then with the scientific method. This is where the scientific method kind of proceeds from. And I'll talk a bit more about that next week in relation to women and science. So of course, if you identify yourself as being supremely rational, then the other, who you're measuring yourself against, has to be of the body, has to be instinctive, has to be driven by passions rather than rationality. And this is all part of the Oriental myth. So the Oriental is also uncivilized, irrational and weak, but mysterious and exotic. There's lots of things about Oriental culture that Europeans found mystifying, but that was kind of okay, because if they're mysterious and exotic, they're suitable cases for scientific experimentation, okay? There's still loads for us to find out. How exciting. Let's do some more travel writing. Also thought of as unstable, so liable to get violent, become emotional, to be irresponsible. The irresponsibility is a massive one. They're irresponsible and they don't take care of their children. We know how to bring up children. You hear a lot of this. This is still perpetuated, okay? That white Europeans have perfected child rearing and that Orientals and other cultures have not. They therefore bring up irresponsible people, and hey, actually, because they don't actually teach them what they shouldn't be doing, maybe we can get away with having sex with them, things like that, okay? Because they don't really know how to behave, so we can't be blamed. We young men that have gone to the Orient can't be blamed. It's their behaviour that makes us have sex with them. This is how the argument goes, and is still perpetuated. And of course, then the white European is thought of as benevolent, and the Oriental, despite being irresponsible, is also cruel and childish. Okay, so this is a very condensed version of the myth of Orientalism. But I've just done it like this to show you the contrast that's constantly made, so that the white European can emerge as the perfect self, as the ideal body. So for Said, this is how the Orient is constructed in Western discourse. It's outside of history, placid and unchanging. In other words, it doesn't have a history and it doesn't progress. Along with the scientific method and the idea that we can have knowledge of ourselves and the world is embedded the idea of progress. That this knowledge, the reason for gaining this knowledge is a constant improvement. Constant improvement of social structures, a constant improvement of the family, of the body, a constant improvement of Europeans' ability to rule. The Orient, on the other hand, is easily enslaved, so placid, and unchanging, never progresses, is always the same. So every image that you see of the Orient represented at all points in history. There is no sense, and you still see this again. There are stereotypical images of the Orient that are reproduced again and again and again. And the assumption is, even though we know better, the assumption is still that this, the Arabian Nights is still around somewhere. Okay, this is part of the mythology. On the other hand, you get the Orient constructed as a kind of ideal, natural place that Europeans, through their desire to understand the world, have fallen from. You get this in the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. A lot of writing in the 19th century lauds the wonderful natural nature of the Orient, the lives that are led, that are uncomplicated, that are unburdened by knowledge, that somehow Europeans need a kind of to go there to refresh themselves. That these simpler folks will kind of in some way give us a boost. And again, there's of course what's implied there is, and we'll go and have sex with them, or this is implied by the men that they'll go and have sex with the women and possibly the children.
That was so strong. So when Benjamin Franklin came over to lobby France, he would come over with coonskin caps and act like this imagined idea of a primitive man, and it was like, oh hey, that friendly chap who's been hanging out with the natives. Yeah. Oh yeah, you could exercise all kinds of you could literally exorcise all your moral failings by going and hanging out with the natives. You could go and be nice to them for a bit, and everybody would think you were a wonderful person, no matter what you did when you came back. Yeah, and it's all there in the art, as you will see. And so, of course, the Orient is also a vast laboratory for Western science. This is the sort of, the deep, exotic, mysterious Orient, which is just there, a huge laboratory waiting for European scientists to come in with their measuring sticks, basically, to come in and take photographs and measure their heads and analyse the culture. Anyway, so what's interesting there, of course, there are no comparable surveys of the West by the East, wherever the East is. But if you look at, there is no literature produced out of the part of the world that Said incorporates into the Orient that analyses scientifically white Europe or white America. And of course, finally, the thing that the Orient is not modern, not postmodern, not referring to something beyond modern.
it's a space that's understood to have never been modern. And modernity is what is ushered in by the Enlightenment, the scientific method, a particular understanding of the structure of living things, and a particular application of this knowledge to manufacturing, to the development of industry. And as far as Orientalism is concerned, the Orient has never been modern, therefore can't have produced actually anything, and certainly can't have produced anything of cultural value. So modernity is tied up not only with the scientific method, with a particular development of capital, so in industrial capitalism, but also with particular forms of culture, the development of art, music, the growth of the novel, things like that. This is modernity. And of course architecture, but you know, I could go on forever. Modernity is huge. But the thing to keep in mind is that the Orient is always assumed to be non-modern, to have not been able, it's not that they just don't have these things, they've never been able to produce it because of their particular characteristics. Okay? So I think I've got some exercises now. We're going to look at some ARPs, but it's 25 past, so maybe have a 10-minute break and then come back. For my beer. I've got 3 images which are paintings that were used for 3 of the editions of Orientalism. There, actually, if you look on the internet and you just type in covers of Edward Said's Orientalism, you'll get dozens of them. I've just chosen 3. This is the most famous. I'm not going to say very much about it. What I want you to do is to have a look at it without Googling it necessarily. And think about all those elements of the Orientalist myth that we've just discussed and see how they are worked through in this particular painting. So look at it semiotically, basically. If you were here for the first class, we did semiotics. So look at the signs and look at the connotations of the various signs. The way to do this is to break it down into its various elements. Some of you might need to come closer to do this. I'm not sure. Don't know whether you can see it from there. And analyse the connotations of the various elements, and then put them all together and see how it is portraying the Orientalist myth, what it's actually trying to tell us, what assumptions it's encoding. Okay? I'll shut up now and I'll leave you alone for 5 minutes. Obviously talk to each other. Okay, so what have we got? What's going on here? Somebody wants to start? Yeah? Go on, Cherry.
Do it. We've had so much. There's just so much to that image. First of all, like, nothing functional is happening. Like, everyone is idle. They're just sitting there watching, like, this incomprehensible thing that is to do with, like, nature and savageness. The guy's naked. There's no women. Yeah. No furniture.
Yes.
So they're like, the kind of the contrast between the beautiful kind of ornate architecture, whatever, that is incomprehensible. We don't know if it's Arabic or it might just be something that looks like Arabic. Yeah. It doesn't look like actual script. And yet no furniture. Yeah. And what else? Oh, about like this might be some kind of a place of spirituality, but there's a snake in it.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, what I want to pick up on there is what you said about laziness. Of course, that's part of the stereotype. That's the myth. They're sitting around doing nothing. So of course they've got no furniture because they're lazy. Okay, they're not civilized, so they haven't worked out that furniture might be a good idea. Yeah. Let's have some other contributions. Yes. Okay, this is partly about perspective. This is the Renaissance perspective that all art of this period is conforming to. That it gives you, that you are the audience, it's a performance entirely for you. And we, the viewer, get to look at what? Somebody tell me what we're looking at.
Karma.
Huh? Karma?
Usually everybody believes in karma. They don't give a damn about anything because they're going to
Not
come
in,
alive again.
not India. It is a fairly generic Oriental scene, but it's not India.
Interestingly, I've been there and it's fantastic.
Uh-huh.
We're looking at a body.
It's a party, okay.
Body.
Oh, sorry, a body. Ah, thank you. We're looking really specifically at a body. And what is this body connoting? Savage child? Yep. Okay, what else? Yes. Available child. Or, yes. Or whore. Okay, poor or whore actually could be either. Okay, so available child, yes. Unclothed child, so yes, definitely could be poor. What else?
I see it more as like an antique sculpture.
An antique
Antique sculpture, yeah.
Explain.
Well, we see a healthy young body of a man as mine, so like some European supremacy, I would say.
Okay, this is... Yeah, I think I'll go with antique sculpture because it certainly recalls that kind of marble nudity, if you like, yeah. Although it is of an Oriental child, so yeah, I'll have to think about that one. Anybody else want to contribute? Oh, hang on, I'll here first and then I'll come to you at the back.
Well, I just think the snake
Yeah.
is temptation.
Thank you. Yes, took us a while to get to the snake. Yeah, and let's go a bit further with that. The snake is temptation. So what is this connoting?
Sex.
Yeah, sex. Thank you.
But it's being tamed.
Sorry.
It's being tamed by
Yes.
the child, so it's like,
Yes. I mean, it's ambiguous. So it's being tamed by the child, but at the same time, it's marking that body in terms of sex, isn't it? Totally. Person back.
Oh no, I was just saying how it relates to the idea of mysticism and the fact that they have this ability to charm snakes. It's that idea of them being closer to nature and
Great, brilliant. Primitivism, yeah. That somehow these people are closer to nature. They have the ability to charm snakes, that they work with the natural world in a way that we don't.
I call it savage.
Savage, thank you. Yes, that's a good word.
That's a European term.
Yeah. So it's the noble savage, isn't it? It's Rousseau's noble savage, yeah. Anything else anybody wants to say?
I think this kid's rather white relative to everyone else. Have you noticed this? Is that
Yeah.
is there-
Well, but then of course you can't really tell because this is it's on. I think skin colour is something you can't tell. I mean, you'd have to look at the actually original painting to get skin colour because you've got two different. If you look at it, two different types of reproduction there, two different colourways. So possibly. I mean, if you're doing an actual semiotic reading of it, the one you're looking at is what's important. So you could actually go there.
But can I say on that point, like the people in the back are like could be from different places and different cultures, just generic kind of not white.
Yeah, it's generic, not white, precisely. And that is part of the myth. It's that there is a kind of generic Oriental that could be found anywhere in that vague terrain that's over there. It's always over there.
And in both reproductions, you can't see the face.
Yeah.
It's completely in shadow.
Yeah. Of course, that's incredibly important that the face is not shown, that only we, the viewer, get to see the nice backside, but the face doesn't matter. Yes. Non-persona, yeah, a non-person, exactly. And in actual fact, I mean, this art critic, who I'm not going to name, because, hey, there are people watching on the live stream. This art critic actually, in his article, thought that the snake, the naked person, was a woman. Now, making that assumption is quite strange. I think perhaps, I think it's possible. I mean, I've always read it as a young boy. So I think it's possible, but, you know, okay, you could maybe assume that it's a young girl, a young woman, I don't know. But the gender is perhaps indeterminate as well. So that there is that suggestion that, you know, of an imperfectly gendered person. I'm not individual, of course. No face, not individual. Yeah. Okay, I've got another one for you. This one's slightly more difficult. I've personally never known entirely what to make of this one, so I'll see what you come up with.
Yeah, we don't know what the hell's going on, really.
No, I think it's. I actually did try to find the complete painting. I think it's a portion of a larger piece. I mean, it's not sort of art I'm particularly interested in, so, you know, you can get really bored trying to find it. But I think that's interesting in itself, that somebody has chosen this portion of I think a larger painting to illustrate Orientalism. Anybody want to suggest any connotations? Yes, over there.
Is it Jesus raising Lazarus
Don't
from the dead?
know. Quite possibly. I believe it's a musical instrument, yes. Yeah.
It's definitely mysterious.
Well, exactly. I think that's the most you can say about it. It's exotic and mysterious. It suggests that there is something there that we can't understand. Yeah? Yes, sure.
But it's got the same tropes. I mean, they're doing something unproductive.
Yes.
That we don't understand. There's no women.
Yeah.
The standing guy, I think it's like an image that's repeated in lots of other paintings. I'm thinking like Nubian soldier or something like this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So he's kind of Jesus-like, but also dangerous because he's got a sword.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like both
dangerous and unpredictable. Yeah. Carrying his weapon even when he's listening to music.
Yeah. What are they doing?
Yeah.
I think he just killed someone. And he's taking a breather.
Very likely. Yeah.
Listening to some music.
He's possibly the executioner having a break. Yeah. Between
It's about to be the musician.
And maybe he's going to behead the musician. Yes. Yeah. Definitely unpredictable. Okay, so there's been no women so far, we have noted, so here's some.
Somebody else.
Anybody?
Should be Megan.
Go on, Sherry.
Okay. So you got the contrast on the presentation of two women, right?
Yeah.
Certainly, right? Like one's this kind of naturalistic, muscly woman, and the other one's hiding away in a very coquettish fashion, right? Away from the viewer and from the.
Right. So, thank you. You've described it. Now, okay. So connotations. Well, actually, he just kind of described it, that you've got the contrast between, obviously, two women, one with very white skin, one with dark skin. The one with white skin is hiding away coquettishly. The one with dark skin has a somewhat muscular body. That was pretty much it, wasn't it? Yeah, okay. Let's develop on that then.
Well, the black woman is in service to the white woman.
Yes.
She is more physical because she's all muscly. She's due to humping around getting a glass of water all the time.
Yep.
We talked about whether the white woman was more central to the painting in terms of the way that the light falls on her as well.
Mm-hmm.
You can't even see the black woman's face. I mean, you can't see either of their faces.
No.
There should be a view.
Yeah.
It's just in the shadow.
Okay. The back there.
Well, you can't really tell where it is, but either way, it's implying colonialism to the white women, and the atmosphere is either influenced by or of an Oriental culture.
Okay, so you've got certain signs there that connote Oriental culture, which is the decoration, the architecture, yes. Okay, and then there's someone just behind you. Yes.
Yeah, we're wondering why someone said coquettish, but it's more like there's almost a sense of fear in the white woman. And you wonder if that's influencing on the watcher, and you need to look after this white woman is actually overcome by this irrational violence.
Possibly, but
Modesty. Does the
yes.
white woman have modesty?
Yes, precisely. Were you going to say that, Cherie? Yes.
Yeah, so we are the kind of, we're looking at her, and
Yes.
relatively we're the white man.
Yes, precisely. We are the viewer. The white woman is modest. She has something the black woman doesn't. She has modesty. She's covering herself because the artist has thought of the viewer. We are given an insight here into something that, particularly if you're a white bloke, you don't normally see. Yeah? So this is kind of somewhat pornographic. You are looking in on a scene that you're not generally allowed to look at, because the viewer is, of course, assumed to be male. Yes, Cherie.
But also it's part of a wider tradition of these kind of white bodies, the reclining nude,
Yes.
with the kind of a black person somewhere in the background.
Yes, it is. It is part of an art tradition. And what does that tell you? What does that connote? Yeah, but how?
By placing people in relationship with each other in the dream.
Yeah. It places people in a particular relationship. It actually, I think it's very important here that the white woman is supposedly modest, because it exposes the dark-skinned woman as being just the opposite. That she doesn't care. So the white-skinned woman cares that someone is looking at her. The dark-skinned woman couldn't care less. Yeah? Anything else? Well, it naturalises the idea of service. I mean, we have talked about the black woman being in service to the white woman, but it completely naturalises that idea. Yeah? Okay, I'm going to move on. I just want to talk for a moment about national identity, which of course is related to our discussion of Orientalism. This is a quote from Benedict Anderson, a much later theorist, who wrote about something he called imagined community. I really like this quote. Think about it for a moment. It says, our understanding of national identity must include the idea we have of it. That's a rather weird way of putting it, but it's also a brilliant way of putting it. He says, since it would not be possible to know all those who share our national identity, we must have a shared idea of what it constitutes. The difference between national identities, therefore, is in the different ways in which they are imagined. So, national identity, what we think of as national identity, is purely imagined. It again is a myth. So the myth of Orientalism has a corresponding myth, which is your own national identity, what you are comparing yourself to. And just to start bringing us up to date, think about this. What is your national identity?
Give the example of German identity, Turkish identity,
Yeah.
to nation, state, or state nation.
And what is it?
Two examples, you say that the Americans in America, United States, although they don't know each other, but they still think that they are one. They pretend that they know each other.
Yeah.
Or as a community.
That's right. Yeah.
Imagine communities.
Yeah.
That's a good example.
What's your imagined community?
I don't believe in neither imagination nor community.
That's very convenient.
It's how my consciousness.
I'm afraid that you do have an imagined community, whether you think you do or not.
It's my choice.
Uh-huh.
I have choices, you see.
Because you're what? What gives you that choice?
I made myself.
Mm-hmm.
I make a choice. I don't have to belong to any identity that's imaginary to so-called nation.
That's nice to think.
There's nothing nice about it. It's the reality.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? What's your... If you had to come up with what your imagined community is, what would it be? What would constitute it? What would be its stereotypical history? What's its media representations? And how are bodies marked as belonging to that? 'Cause this is where it gets uncomfortable, you see. Nobody wants to admit that they have a national identity. White middle class. But yeah, okay. Okay, right, fine. Yep.
I go to anti-institution lectures about race when you're a white person.
Yep. Okay. But that's not a national identity. That is a kind of class and generational identity. Yes.
I'll give you one. We're both from New Zealand, which is tied up in weirdness because over there you're British because you're white, and over here your whiteness is not Britishness, it's New Zealandness.
That's the kind of thing I was hoping for, because I know I'm sitting in a room full of people that generally aren't British. Any British people in here?
Yeah.
Oh, look! Oh, we got a few. But not many. This is London.
Just don't like to talk about it.
No, I know. Yes.
I am an American. We're very loud. We throw ourselves around the world and take control of things.
Yeah, that's the kind of cynical version. What's the other version?
Bring freedom to everyone.
Yeah, bring freedom to everyone. Yeah. Let's have some more. What other national identities have we got in the room?
European.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, my God. That's one that I'm going to have to let go of pretty soon. Well, hopefully not, but yeah. That actually, I recently came back from Spain through Gatwick, and just actually it hit me that part of my national identity is European, and that pretty soon I won't be able to go to the little booth that says EU citizens. And that is actually quite a shock. That's when it actually was brought home to me. Okay. Any other national identities that people want to admit to? Yes. So I'll come to you in a minute. French.
Yeah, I'm French, and I've been told we invented culture. Then I figured out it wasn't true.
But most of them are not true. I mean, this is the thing. So, yes, Shiri.
I was just going to say that in 2011, when it was the census thing, there was a question, what is your national identity?
Yeah.
And I'm a migrant.
Yeah.
I moved here, but I've lived here 20 years. And
Yeah.
I was like, I actually looked at that question for 20 minutes. And like,
Yeah.
I don't have the answer anymore. And then I explained it to my son, who's sitting here at the back, and he said, oh, Italian. He's not Italian.
Okay. So you can be Italian as well, Shiri, if you want. Yeah. I'm sure. If any Italians object? There you go. Okay, so now that we've kind of broken the back of national identity, let's have a look at Edward Said in his own words.
The attack came without warning, and according to a U.S. government source, told CBS News that it has
Have the sound up a bit.
written all over it.
The attack in Oklahoma City appears to have a familiar mark.
This was done with the intent to inflict as many casualties as possible. That is a Middle Eastern trait.
The fact that it was such a powerful bomb in Oklahoma City immediately drew investigators to consider deadly parallels that all have roots in the Middle East.
ABC News has learned that the FBI has asked the U.S. military to provide up to 10 Arabic speakers to help in the investigation.
Orientalism tries to answer the question of why, when we think of the Middle East, for example, we have a preconceived notion of what kind of people live there, what they believe, how they act, even though we may never have been there or indeed even met anyone from there. More generally, Orientalism asks, how do we come to understand people, strangers, who look different to us by virtue of the color of their skin? The central argument of Orientalism is that the way we acquire this knowledge is not innocent or objective, but the end result of a process that reflects certain interests. That is, it is highly motivated. Specifically, Said argues that the way the West, Europe and the US, looks at the countries and peoples of the Middle East is through a lens that distorts the actual reality of those places and those people. He calls this lens through which we view that part of the world Orientalism, a framework that we use to understand the unfamiliar and the strange, to make the peoples of the Middle East appear different and threatening. At the heart of how this new American Orientalism operates is the threatening and demonized figure of the Islamic terrorist that is emphasized by journalists and Hollywood.
The so-called independent media in a liberal society like this, in effect, are so lazy and are controlled by interests that are commercial and political at the same time, that there is no investigative reporting. It's just basically repeating the line of the government.
Only 8 days ago, I concluded a broadcast on the World Trade Center bombing by telling you what senior U.S. law enforcement officials were telling us, that the threat of Muslim extremists operating within the United States is an ongoing danger, something we'll have to live with from now on.
And repeating the lines of the people who have the most influence, for whom Islam is a useful foreign demon to turn attention away from the inequities and problems in our own society. So, as a result, the human side of the Islamic and especially Arabic world are rarely to be found. And the net result is this vacancy on the one hand, and these easy, almost automatic images of terror and violence. The situation in the popular media is basically that Muslims are really two things. One, they're villains of one sort, villains and fanatics.
I will dispatch the American people to the hell they deserve.
And B, many films end up with huge numbers of bodies, Muslim bodies, strewn all over the place, the result of Arnold Schwarzenegger or Demi Moore, Chuck Norris. Lots of films about guerrillas going in to kill Muslim terrorists. So the idea of Islam is something to be stamped out.
Now, Said recognizes that terrorism exists as a result of the violent political situation in the Middle East. But he argues that there is a lot more going on there that is misunderstood or not seen by the peoples of the West. The result of the media's focus on one negative aspect alone means that all the peoples of the Islamic world come to be understood in the same negative and paranoid way. That is, as a threat. So that when we think of people who look like that and who come from that part of the world, we think fanatic, extreme, violent. Said argues that understanding a vast and complex region like the Middle East in this narrow way takes away from the humanity and diversity of millions of ordinary people living decent and humane lives there.
it's easy to attract attention, and certainly the media's attention, for some of the political reasons that are obvious. I mean, to discredit the Arabs, to make them seem like a threat to the West, to keep the idea around at the end of the Cold War that, you know, there are foreign devils. Otherwise, what are we doing with this gigantic military? And the result is it's very hard to find works that are sympathetic to the Arabs and Islam. Islam is seen as the enemy of Christianity, and the United States sees itself as a Christian or Judeo-Christian country in affiliation with Israel, and that Islam is the great enemy, the competitor. There's a history of that. The challenge now is the challenge. I wouldn't call it anything other than coexistence. How does one coexist with people whose religions are different, whose traditions and languages are different, but who form part of the same community or polity in a national sense? How do we accept difference without violence and hostility? And it's that attitude, I think, that we need.
And with that in mind, I've got another piece of film. This is pretty horrible, but I want to show it to you anyway. Just bear in mind everything that Saeed just said, and then watch. This is from 2012. It's a film I've never seen all the way through, I admit. It's Sacha Baron Cohen, who is, well, whatever. I think you need to do an exercise on this very briefly before we finish. Think about the connotations here of this particularly Sacha Baron Cohen's character.
Al-Din. According to Wadiyan propaganda, Hafez al-Din was born in 1970.
It's a bit quieter, but you can hear it, can't you?
He did not know his mother, who died in childbirth. He hosted his own Olympic Games. At which he won 14 gold medals. With pleasure mounting, Al-Din addressed his nation today.
I come before you today to tell you that the world shall kneel before our great nation. We are 2 months away from enriching weapons-grade uranium to be used for peaceful purposes. It will be used only for medical research and clean energy. It will, and will certainly never be used to attack oh boy.
Looks like we need to find a new double.
Because this one is, you know, I don't know if it's going to get better.
Oh, he's not going to recover, sir. He's dead.
Send his wife some chocolate-covered almond nuts in a cellophane wrapped box. Delicious.
We are going to send your wife some almonds, chocolate-covered versions of this, of your Marouche. I think I
almond in his head, and they say, why is there an almond in his head? Take it out. Clean it. I'm not gonna eat that. Don't speak. Maru. Listen, everything's gonna be just fine. I don't want you to worry about anything. Now, how about looking in my eye when I'm speaking to you? You know, it's very rude not to look at somebody in the eye when they are talking to you. It's okay. Don't worry, you're having a rough day. Megan! You now have herpes. Megan, you are worth every penny.
You are super hot. Is my jet ready?
Yes, but do you want to stay the night? You know, I really want to do some cuddling.
No, your time is up. I have to be with the Italian Prime Minister tomorrow.
Okay, Baruch, give the goodie bag. I trust everything is in there as your manager requested.
Katy Perry said she got a diamond Rolex.
But that's because she left me Aladdin in her face. Right. Are you sure you don't want to stay for some cuddle?
No.
But please, I really want someone to cuddle.
Yeah, bored with that. So, what do you reckon? What's going on? This is 2012. Sacha Baron Cohen makes a film that he calls The Dictator. I mean, you've had lots of practice in analysing images through Orientalist theory now. So what do you make of this? Think about it and talk about it for a few minutes. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. Something else going on here. Anybody?
What else is going on is the wider context of war.
Yeah.
And some pretty shitty comedy, really.
But why is it shitty comedy? This is what we need to analyse. Yes. I would completely agree with you, but let's take a few steps back and ask ourselves how it's doing this. How is it portraying the stereotypes? What's it working with?
It's working with the media narrative that the Middle East is populated by one-dimensional, power-hungry dictators that are seeking kind of war with the West.
Yeah.
And are, even on those terms, stupid, incompetent, and corrupt, and prone to irrational violence.
Yeah. Okay. Develop on that.
I could be wrong, but my sense is that Sacha Baron Cohen takes like these societal narratives that we have and attempts to subvert them by making them so perverse. The issue is that because they are societal narratives, that perversion is lost on most people, and it just comes across as you know, for example, if you're a 10-year-old watching this, or whatever Foucault is, you know, they don't understand. Well, they don't understand that the subversion is lost on them, and it just buys into this damaging story.
Well, the point is that you have to know who Sacha Baron Cohen is and what he does.
Yeah.
I didn't when I first saw this. I thought, oh my God. and you know, I only ever saw this clip, and I came across it because I typed in a search for something to do with Orientalism. Seriously. So it's like, it's not that it's just that unsophisticated people don't understand Sacha Baron Cohen's humour. It's that you have to kind of have you have to be party to a particular discourse, which I obviously was not when I first discovered this. I kind of knew who Sacha Baron Cohen was, but I hadn't taken much notice. So it's aimed at a particular constituency, obviously of which I was not a member. And so, and you know, as you say, what it does, the effect that it has, particularly in the medium of YouTube, which is where I took this from, is that it simply perpetuates Orientalist discourse. This is, anyway, the way that I read it. And I think that there are a great many, I mean, Turkish Delight ads, we haven't seen them for years. I don't know if anybody else here is old enough to remember Turkish Delight ads. Look them up. They're on YouTube, okay? They completely and utterly perpetuate Orientalist discourse. In fact, Turkish Delight is still it's a chocolate bar thing. It's still on sale. Have a look. It's still on sale. And it has a particular aesthetic that perpetuates Orientalist discourse. So, you know, it is still around us all the time, and it is still pervasive, and it is having an effect. And it has an effect within, not just on our attitude towards the Middle East, but on our attitudes towards people who are perceived as different, who are perceived as other within our own cultures, right here, right now. Okay, thank you everybody. See you next week, hopefully.